And in the thick of it all were the queens, not always ruling from a throne, but often from behind a carefully drawn curtain, manipulating pawns and knights in games that spanned decades. The velvet-draped thrones weren't just symbols of majesty, they were stages where reputations could be destroyed with a single raised eyebrow. One fringe detail catches your attention. In some courts, the act of not speaking could be as loud as a royal decree. In the glittering silence between songs or speeches, a queen's refusal to acknowledge someone could start a rumor that burned through the city by dawn. The medieval gossip network, fueled by servants, traveling merchants, and minor nobles, was as quick and vicious as any social media thread you've ever scrolled through at 2 a.m. A trio of musicians pluck at lutes in the corner, their eyes darting toward a woman whose gown trails so far it's practically a second guest. You're told she's a cousin to the queen, but the way the queen's hand tightens on her goblet says the story is more complicated. Maybe it's an affair, maybe it's politics. In this place, there's rarely much difference. You keep walking and catch sight of a small alcove lined with relics, a silver hand mirror, a pair of ivory-handled scissors, a small book bound in dark leather. Each belonged to a different queen, and each is steeped in its own quiet scandal. The mirror once sat on the vanity of Marie Antoinette. Before the Revolution, before the mobs, the scissors. They were allegedly used by Queen Margaret of Anjou to cut up a love letter from an enemy who'd offered peace terms. And the book. Historians still debate whether it's a devotional prayer book or a coded diary of courtly affairs. You lean closer to the book, the leather cracked with age, the edges worn soft. The script inside is faded, looping, hard to read. Maybe it's nothing more than psalms in Latin, or maybe it's the key to understanding why a war lasted a decade longer than it should have. That's the lure of these stories, facts and whispers blurred together until they're inseparable. Somewhere behind you a servant drops a tray, and the sharp clatter makes you jump. Heads turn, conversations pause, and for a moment you see the court for what it really is, a fragile ecosystem where every movement matters. A single mistake, and you could find yourself replaced in someone's favor. A single bold move, and you might become the subject of the next scandalous ballad sung by traveling minstrels. And yes, medieval minstrels were basically the podcast hosts of their day, only with more rhymes and fewer advertisements for ergonomic mattresses. They'd carry tales of queens from one village to the next, embellishing them with each retelling. By the time the story reached the far edges of the kingdom, a mild disagreement between a queen and her courtier could have transformed into a midnight duel over forbidden love. Hey guys, tonight we slip past the heavy velvet curtains into a world where candle flames dance and shadows stretch long across marble floors. You can hear the faint clink of goblets, the shuffle of embroidered slippers on mosaic tiles, and somewhere in the air there's the sharp tang of beeswax and spiced wine. In this hush, your heartbeat feels loud, like maybe someone will notice you've wandered where you shouldn't. You're about to stroll through centuries of courts and castles, but not the polished version your high school history teacher mumbled through. This is the one with whispers in corridors, the one with smirk-covered gossip, the one where the queens don't always sip tea, they pour it, steaming hot, directly into the lap of history. You probably won't survive this. Well, not without at least rethinking every old textbook you ever read. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love it if you drop a comment with your location and the local time, so I can picture you listening in some far-off corner of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You drift down a great hall lined with faded tapestries, each one stitched with the likeness of a queen whose face is forever caught in that perfect balance between innocence and calculation. The air hums with the unspoken truth that royal courts were not polite dinner parties. They were arenas, and scandal was the most prized weapon. In these long corridors of power, every glance could be a move in a game, every gesture an act in an endless play that decided the fate of nations. There's Eleanor of Aquitaine. Her eyes glint with a mix of defiance and humour as she sizes up a court full of men who underestimate her. She's wearing a crown that cat chose the light, but the way she tilts her head makes it feel like the crown's just an accessory, not the source of her authority. And there, in a darkened alcove, Isabella of France stands with her chin lifted, listening as an ally whispers something dangerous in her ear. You're not supposed to hear it, but the flicker of her smile tells you it's the sort of plan that can topple a king. As you move, you realize each queen is framed not just by her jewels and gowns, but by the stories, half-truths, rumors, sometimes outright fabrications that cling to her name like perfume that won't wash off. Historians still argue whether some of these tales are fact or the medieval equivalent of tabloid headlines. Did Catherine de' Medici really keep poison hidden in jeweled rings, or was that just a convenient myth spun by her enemies? Did Lucrezia Borgia genuinely take part in the Vatican's darker intrigues, or was she simply a woman in a man's game, blamed for sins she didn't commit? You pass a long banquet table, its surface scratched and worn, but still faintly smelling of roasted boar, cinnamon, and old wine. Imagine the scenes it's witnessed. Nobles laughing a bit too loudly at the wrong joke, alliances sealed with a handshake under the table, secret messages slipped beneath a plate of figs. In medieval courts, power was rarely a straightforward ladder. It was more like a spiral staircase, and every step you took could send you either higher toward influence or tumbling down into exile. You pause near a high arched window. The cold night air slips in, carrying the scent of wood smoke and distant rain. Outside, torches line the courtyard, flickering like fireflies caught in the wind. Somewhere in those shadows, deals are being struck and alliances are being tested. The queens inside know this. They've built their power not just on laws and armies, but on the ability to read a room faster than anyone else. And here's the quiet truth you start to notice. Scandal wasn't always a weakness. Sometimes it was armor. A well-timed rumor could distract enemies, turn public opinion, even end a war without a single arrow loosed. The queens who survived weren't always the purest or the most virtuous. They were the ones who understood that in a world of velvet-draped thrones and whispered sins, perception was as valuable as gold. You feel the weight of centuries pressing close, the heat of too many candles, the low murmur of voices plotting futures you'll never see. Somewhere deep in the hall, a new queen is being crowned, her smile as sharp as the dagger she keeps hidden beneath her sleeve. And you can't help but wonder, what stories will they whisper about her when her reign is over? You drift onward, the hall narrowing into a long gallery hung with maps, brittle parchment sheets inked in looping calligraphy, each marking territories that have been won, lost, or traded away in marriages more complicated than any family reunion you've ever attended. At the far end, a tall window lets in a pale wash of moonlight, and in that silver glow she appears, Eleanor of Aquitaine. She doesn't need an introduction. Her presence is the kind you feel before you see. You notice her posture first, shoulders back, chin level, a bearing that says she belongs anywhere she stands. She's wrapped in a gown of deep green velvet, heavy with embroidery, and her crown, though smaller than you expect, catches the light like a private joke between her and the moon. You follow her into a bustling court, the air thick with incense and voices. Eleanor's story doesn't just pass through history, it shapes it. Here's a fact you can't avoid. She was Queen of France, then Queen of England, and the mother of two kings, Richard the Lionheart and King John. Historians still argue whether she was the single most influential woman of the 12th century or just the most talked about. Either way, she played the long game. You catch snippets of her life like reflections in a rippling fountain. She rides at the head of a crusade, armoured in silk and resolve, ignoring those who think women should be content watching battles from a tapestry. She sits beside King Louis VII in Paris, but the way her gaze drifts toward the poets and troubadours says her heart isn't tied to this throne alone. Then, in a twist most soap operas wouldn't dare attempt, she divorces Louis, something nearly unheard of, and marries Henry Plantagenet, who will soon be King of England. Here, amid candlelight and carved oak, the gossip is relentless. They whisper that Eleanor encouraged courtly love, the romantic ideal where Knightdice. Geats pined for unattainable ladies, and that her patronage of poets was a thin veil over her own restless affections. Some say she flirted too openly, others that she simply refused to shrink herself to fit the narrow frame of medieval expectations. One fringe tidbit makes you grin. There's a tale that Eleanor once disguised herself to slip into a tournament, not to watch the jousting, but to secretly tip off her favourite knight on how to win his bout. Whether it's true or not, you can't help picturing her smirking in the stands, hood pulled low, cheering louder than the men. You watch her navigate a room thick with politics. She leans toward a noble from Aquitaine, her words low, her eyes fixed on his. You can't hear her, but you don't need to. This is a negotiation, and she's winning. Across the room, Henry glances over, maybe with pride, maybe with suspicion. Their marriage, like so many royal unions, is less a love story and more a joint stock company, its assets being armies, lands, and alliances. The tension between them eventually becomes public theatre. She sides with her sons in a rebellion against Henry, an act as dangerous as it is scandalous. Imagine it, supporting your children in overthrowing their father, and not from the safety of whispers, but in open defiance. Historians still debate whether her motive was maternal loyalty, personal resentment, or pure political calculus. You suspect it was all three, woven together like the intricate patterns in her gown. You drift with her into a quieter chamber. The noise fades, replaced by the muted crackle of a fire. Here she is, older now, her hair threaded with silver, her eyes still sharp. She survived imprisonment, outlived rivals, and kept her dignity intact in a world where reputations were as fragile as glass goblets. The scandal around her never really dies. It just changes form, morphing from accusations of impropriety to awe at her resilience. You pause beside a tapestry showing her with Richard the Lionheart, their hands almost touching, the space between them charged with unspoken history. There's a rumour, likely false but persistent, that she was closer to Richard than a mother should be. The fact that such whispers clung to her even in old age tells you how strong her legend was. In medieval Europe, a woman who stepped outside the lines drawn for her was often painted in colours that suited her enemies. She turns to you suddenly, as if sensing your presence. Her voice, when it comes, is low and deliberate. They'll remember what suits them, she says, and forget what doesn't. The trick is to make sure what they remember serves you. Then she's gone, moving back toward the crowd, her green velvet fading into the swirl of gowns and cloaks. You step back, the fire's warmth still on your face, and realize how rare it was for a queen to hold so much influence across two realms and decades of shifting power. Eleanor didn't just survive scandal, she used it, like a sculptor using flaws in the marble to give the statue more character. Outside, the moon slips behind a cloud, casting the hall into deeper shadow. You feel the pull to follow her story further, but she's already beyond reach, her laughter blending with the court's murmur. Somewhere in the next chamber, another queen waits, her own whispers and dangers ready for you to overhear. You drift toward a smaller, colder hall where the tapestries hang heavier, their colours dulled by time and the weight of secrets. The smell shifts, less sweet wine, more damp stone, and iron hinges. Somewhere a torch sputters, and you can hear the faint drip of water echoing from some unseen corner. This is the realm of Isabella of France, a queen whose beauty was matched only by the sharpness of her ambition. They called her the she-wolf of France, though historians still argue whether the name was an earned testament to her cunning or a smear campaign written by enemies with too much ink and too few morals. Either way, her story is one of power plays, betrayal, and a scandal that shook the very foundations of England's monarchy. You catch sight of her now, tall, poised, with eyes the colour of the Channel on a cloudy day. She wears a gown of pale blue silk, a shade chosen not just for beauty but for the political message it carries, cool, untouchable, and impossible to ignore. Around her neck glitters a chain of gold so fine it seems to float above her collarbone, a gift from her husband, King Edward II. Though her half-smile makes you suspect she values it less than the dagger hidden beneath her sleeve. Isabella's marriage to Edward was a union of kingdoms meant to bind England and France in peace. But peace is rarely the natural state of monarchies, and here it cracked quickly. Edward's favouritism towards certain courtiers, most famously Piers Gaveston, didn't just raise eyebrows, it set the entire court aflame with whispers. The king's affection for Gaveston was intense, and in an age when alliances were everything, such open devotion to one man, noble or not, was dangerous. Isabella, pushed to the sidelines, watched as her influence waned, her husband's attention fixed elsewhere. You can almost feel the shift in her, a cold calculation setting in, the sort that comes when survival demands more than patience. Historians debate whether she was genuinely humiliated or simply saw in Edward's weakness the opportunity to take control. Either way, her next moves would make her infamous. One fringe tidbit floats through your mind. A legend claims that Isabella once sent her husband a gift of beautifully embroidered cushions, knowing they would be intercepted by his enemies and used as proof of her complicity in a plot against him. Whether or not it's true, the image is striking, a queen weaponizing even her domestic graces for political ends. You follow her through the court as tensions rise. Edward's unpopular reign breeds rebellion, and Isabella begins forging her own alliances, most notably with Roger Mortimer, a man whose charm is matched by his ambition. The exact nature of their relationship is still debated. Were they lovers plotting in candlelit secrecy, or simply political partners bound by shared goals? The truth has been blurred by centuries of retelling, each historian adding their own layer of drama or denial. The air grows heavier as you step into the council chamber. Maps of England and France lie spread across the table, little wooden markers showing the positions of armies. Isabella leans over the table, her fingers resting lightly on the borderlands between the two countries. Her voice is low, measured, but you can hear the steel in it as she suggests terms that would weaken Edward's position while strengthening her own. A few nobles glance nervously at one another. Some are already calculating how to align themselves with her before the tides turn. The turning point comes when Isabella and Mortimer, exiled to France, raise an army to invade England. Imagine it. Sailing across the Channel not as a diplomatic envoy, but as a military force, banners snapping in the wind, the cold spray of seawater on your face. You land not as a returning queen, but as a conqueror. The invasion is swift. Edward is captured and forced to abdicate in favour of his young son, Edward III, with Isabella acting as regent. For a moment she holds the power she's been circling for years. But scandal shadows her victory. Rumours swirl that Edward II was murdered, and the manner of his death becomes one of the most infamous tales in English history. The grisly story involving a red-hot poker is likely propaganda, but it lingers, sticky and impossible to wash away. You watch her now in the throne room, Mortimer at her side, the boy king between them. She wears her crown lightly, as if daring anyone to try and take it from her. Yet power, once seized, is never entirely secure. The nobles grow restless under her rule, suspicious of Mortimer's influence and her refusal to step aside gracefully. Eventually Edward III comes of age and stages his own coup, arresting Mortimer and stripping Isabella of much of her authority. She's not executed, perhaps a son's final act of mercy, but she's removed from the centre of power, retreating into a quieter life. You find her, in that later chapter, in a castle on the edge of the realm, still draped in fine gowns but with fewer visitors at her table. The firelight catches the silver in her hair, and her eyes still hold that cool, assessing glint. She's lived through the rise and fall of her own making, and though she no longer commands armies, she still commands the room. She turns her gaze toward you, a faint smile on her lips. "They called me a wolf," she murmurs. "But wolves do not live by permission." Then sing. He looks back to the flames, and you understand that even in her reduced circumstances, the game has never entirely left her. Somewhere deep in the castle you hear the faint strains of music, perhaps a minstrel singing of her deeds, perhaps just the wind in the chimney. Outside the night is cold and endless, but inside, Isabella's story still burns, an ember that refuses to die. The air grows warmer again as you step away from Isabella's shadowed halls and into a more intimate space. The ceilings are lower here, the walls closer, hung not with war maps, but with silken draperies in colours that seem to shift in the flicker of the firelight. The smell changes too, less of damp stone and more of herbs crushed underfoot, their resinous scent curling upward like invisible threads. Somewhere, a brazier sizzles, and you catch the sharp note of rosemary, the sweetness of lavender, and something darker, something you can't quite place. Here is Joan of Navarre, queen, stepmother, and the subject of rumours that danced dangerously close to the word witch. She stands near the hearth, her gown a rich burgundy that drinks in the light, her sleeves lined with fur, soft enough to silence even the most eager gossipers. She is still deliberate, every movement precise, as though she knows how easily one gesture can be twisted into evidence. Joan's story begins in Navarre, but she marries into the English court as the second wife of King Henry IV. It should be a position of security, yet from the moment she arrives, suspicion hangs around her like a stubborn fog. Her marriage is political, yes, but she and Henry are said to have been genuinely fond of each other, a rare sweetness in the hard metal of medieval unions. One undeniable historical fact: Joan was accused after Henry's death of practicing witchcraft against her stepson, King Henry V. The charges claimed she used sorcery to plot his death, an accusation that carried as much political convenience as personal malice. Historians still argue whether this was an honest belief in her guilt, a move to strip her of wealth and influence, or simply a product of the era's uneasy mix of religion, superstition, and courtly backstabbing. You follow her to a small table where a box of carved wood sits open, revealing an assortment of objects, tiny vials sealed with wax, dried petals wrapped in linen, and a single polished stone that glows faintly in the firelight. Are they the tools of a healer, the props of a witch, or simply keepsakes from home? Here lies the problem with Joan's scandal. It exists in the shadows between truth and accusation. One fringe tidbit you can't resist noting. Some say Joan had a habit of burning incense late at night, a habit that servants found unsettling. The scent would drift down corridors, clinging to clothes and hair, so that even those who hadn't seen her knew she'd been working. On what? No one could say. You watch her walk through the court, her back straight despite the stairs. Her French accent sets her apart, her foreign customs making easy fodder for those who already want her gone. When Henry IV dies, her position becomes precarious. She's no longer queen consort, just a dowager queen at the mercy of her stepson's goodwill. And Henry V, though not openly cruel, is pragmatic. When tensions rise, political, financial, perhaps even personal, he moves against her. She is arrested in 1419, her household reduced, her assets seized. Imagine the silence of that moment, the echoing emptiness of rooms once full of courtiers, the sudden absence of the soft rustle of servants' skirts. Joan is kept under a sort of genteel imprisonment, her isolation a message to anyone else tempted to meddle in the king's affairs. You picture her alone in her chamber, candlelight pooling on the floor, her hands folded around that polished stone from the wooden box. Outside, guards murmur to one another, but inside, the air feels thick with her unspoken thoughts. Was she planning revenge, or simply surviving, knowing that patience is its own form of resistance? Historians debate whether Henry V eventually released her out of genuine remorse or calculated politics. Either way, Joan regains her freedom in 1422 after his death and returns to her estates in relative peace. But the stain of the accusations never quite fades. Witchcraft is the kind of charge that lingers in the corners of a reputation, no matter the truth. You see her now in her later years walking through gardens thick with lavender and sage, her gown trailing in the dirt. She bends to pluck a sprig of rosemary, the same herb you smelled earlier, and slips it into a pouch at her waist. The sun is low, casting the world in gold, and for a moment she looks not like a disgraced queen, but like any woman tending her garden. Yet even here, away from court, the whispers follow. Villagers speak of the witch queen in hushed tones, though they'll accept her coins and nod politely when she passes. You suspect Joan understands this duality, that sometimes the most scandalous thing a woman can do is keep living when others have written her off. As the evening deepens, you step back into the shadows of her garden. The air is heavy with the scent of herbs, and somewhere behind you the castle bells toll the hour. Joan doesn't flinch. She's weathered worse sounds, accusations, verdicts, the rustle of retreating allies, and in this moment she seems entirely unbothered, as though she's already outlived the worst of her scandal, leaving the rest for history to untangle or enjoy. You follow the herb-scented air out of Joan's garden and back into a city's night, Paris, its streets a lattice of torchlight and murmurs, the Seine sliding past like a ribbon of ink. Wind brushes your cheek with the chill of water and stone, and there ahead looms the silhouette you've come for, the Tour de Nesle, a stout riverside tower whose shadow falls across rumour like a seal on melted wax. You step closer, and the stones seem to hold their breath, as if they remember every whisper that ever grazed them. Inside these walls, so the tale goes, Marguerite of Burgundy kept secrets that outpaced even the city's busiest gossips. She's the young queen you've heard of in passing, the wife of Louis, the future Louis VII of France, and the daughter-in-law of the iron-willed Philip IV. A fact to anchor you, in 1314 accusations of adultery exploded at court, pointing at 3 royal daughters-in-law, with Marguerite at the scandal's blazing centre. The phrase Tour de Nesle affair still crackles like static. Even now, centuries later, it sounds like the title of a drama miniseries you'd binge at 2 a.m. while pretending you'll just watch one episode. You step through a narrow doorway into a chamber filled with the scent of old lime plaster, damp rope, and the faintest memory of perfume. Here, the story rings with names you already know. Isabella of France, the same queen you watched storm across England's history, allegedly noticed that 2 handsome young knights, Philippe and Gautier d'Aunay, were sporting costly purses she'd gifted to her sisters-in-law. That detail, embroidered silk swinging from armour belts, is the quirky thread people love to pull. Did Isabella spot it in a moment of eagle-eyed pettiness, or was it just one more stitch in a tapestry of suspicion? Historians still argue whether Isabella's role in discovering the affair was decisive brilliance or later embro, eyed by chroniclers eager to cast her as the perpetual plot detector. Either way, a purse becomes a plot point, proof that in royal courts, accessories are never just accessories. The accusations break like a winter river, swift and merciless. Marguerite, along with Blanche of Burgundy and Jeanne of Burgundy, is dragged into the glare of public scrutiny. The Darnay brothers are seized. Confessions are extracted under methods we won't detail at bedtime. Call it the medieval version of agree to terms or else. You've learned enough in these halls to know that confessions under pressure often say more about fear than truth, and historians still argue whether the charges were entirely fabricated to control succession politics or painfully true and simply convenient. You might wish for a neat answer, but neat answers don't tend to survive in rooms like this. Marguerite's world shrinks fast. You feel it as you trail her steps from glittering fates to stark stone. One day she's at court, a queen with a future. The next she's shuttered in Chateau Gaillard, a fortress turned cage high above the Seine's bend. She's barely in her 20s, and the silence pressing on her window is the kind that turns gossip into echoing verdicts. The mainstream fact lands with a softened thud. Marguerite will die in captivity in 1315, shortly after her husband Louis becomes king, an outcome that makes every corridor you're walking feel colder. You trace your fingers along a slit window. Wind breathes through it like a secret trying to escape. Tradition insists that the trysts took place in or around the Tour de Nesle, that signals flashed from windows, that the tower's shadows swallowed rendezvous at twilight. A fringe tidbit flutters to you. Some retellings claim the lovers timed their meetings by the candle marks of a specific chapel bell across the river. Romance with an alarm clock, medieval edition. Is it true? Maybe. Maybe it's just the sort of charming logistics rumour that storytellers adore. But you can almost hear the bell counting down to disaster. Marguerite's name becomes a shorthand warning. Not only a queen fallen from grace, but a wedge splitting the question of who has the right to inherit. The scandal's shockwaves roll forward into law and lineage. When the Capetian line faces the problem of succession, sons dying, daughters remaining, the crown's lawyers tilt hard toward barring women from the throne and conveniently from transmitting claims through them. The so-called Salic law posture, stressed and reinterpreted in these decades, gains ominous vigor here. Historians still argue whether this scandal directly catalyzed that hardening of inheritance rules or merely provided convenient rhetoric. But the line from the tower's shadow to future wars is easy to trace with your fingertip across a map. You can practically feel the parchment heat as you slide from 1314 to the 100 Years' War's first sparks. You descend a spiral stair, its treads buttery with centuries of feet. A draft lifts your cloak, okay, your hoodie, you're not fooling anyone, and you catch a whisper of voices, court ladies rehearsing testimony, minor nobles rehearsing outrage, clerics rehearsing the expression that says, "We take no pleasure in this," while absolutely taking notes for a future sermon. The city outside gulps the rumour whole. At street level, bakers shape bread into scandalous silhouettes, best not to specify, and hawkers shout that truth will be revealed tomorrow. Classic marketing strategy then as now. Joke one for the night. If medieval Paris had a notifications tab, it would be on fire. You pause in a chamber dimmed by a single oil lamp and see Marguerite imagined there, dark hair unbound, hands white around a rosary, the skin of her knuckles pulled tight. She isn't a caricature of sin, nor a saint of patience. She's a woman in a vice, caught between a husband who's more crown than heart, and a father-in-law who treats dynastic order like a religious sacrament. A detail, softer this time, The inventory of her belongings, reduced and catalogued, includes small scents, little bottles of rosewater and clove. You think back to Joan's incense, to Catherine's rumoured vials, and you feel how all these women were rendered suspect by anything that smelled unusual. Joke 2. Medieval courts would have side-eyed your lavender oat milk candle like it was plotting a coup. When Louis ascends in 1314 as king, the throne grows no softer. Marguerite remains confined, the marriage effectively a memory. By 1315 she's dead, perhaps a fever, perhaps the cold of a damp cell, perhaps something more deliberate carried out under the blanket of plausible deniability. Historians still argue whether her end was natural or nudged. Either way, the king soon remarries, eager to produce a legitimate heir without the static of scandal. The speed with which royal life moves on is its own sort of indictment, and you feel it like a door that closes quietly and never opens again. You slip back toward the river, and the tower follows you in your peripheral vision like a guilty thought. That's the skill of architecture that witnesses too much. It turns into an accomplice in memory, shaping how later centuries visualize events they didn't see. By the time poets and playwrights are done with the Tour de Nestlé, it becomes a stage so famous that people forget the street around it had real bakers, real cats, real neighbours who complained about the noise. Joke 3. Somewhere a medieval landlord is definitely writing, great location, historic views, minor rumour problem. And there's still Isabella's thread tugging at your sleeve. Did she truly catch the first whiff of the scandal by noticing those purses, or did chroniclers retrofit her into the story to give it that satisfying symmetrical flavour? The future she-wolf sniffing out perfidy in Paris before she ever hunted in England. The debate is a tug-of-war across centuries, and the rope burns your hands even now. You remember how, earlier, a gift could become evidence. Here, a purse becomes a fuse. If you're keeping score, your facts rest like bookends. The Tour de Nestlé was a real Parisian tower along the Seine. Marguerite of Burgundy, queen to Louis X, was accused of adultery in 1314. She died in captivity in 1315. Between those bookends, interpretations pile up, some grim, some theatrical, all insistently human. A fringe note curls at the edge. Certain late sources insist the lovers sometimes hid in wine barrels rolled into service passages. It sounds absurd until you realize courtiers regularly smuggled everything from letters to lapdogs through kitchens, add ill-advised romance to the inventory, and the kitchen staff just shrugs and keeps chopping onions. You let the city's night fold around you. The river moves like time itself, unimpressed, unhurried. Somewhere a bell marks the hour, and you feel how the scandal, however lurid in retelling, was first and last about control. Control of narrative, bodies, lineage, thrones. Marguerite's name lingers because it became useful as cautionary example, as legal wedge, as tragic headline drafted in Gothic script. That's the old lesson these queens keep teaching you. A whisper in the right architecture can echo longer than a shout in the open air, and when you finally turn your back on the tower, you carry the chill with you, a souvenir pressed like a leaf in a book. Tomorrow, the river will look the same. The stones will say nothing. But you've heard enough to fill the silence, and you can't help glancing once more over your shoulder, as if in the highest window someone might lift a shutter, flash a signal, and start the story all over again. The road away from Paris winds over damp earth and through a mist so thick it clings to your hair like silk threads. Your steps fall softer as the air grows heavier, and before long the mist gives way to the polished, echoing expanse of an English court. Here the tapestries are newer, the torches burn hotter, and the faces you pass seem to wear two expressions at once, welcoming smiles and eyes that measure every move you make. Somewhere in this maze of gilded halls and subtle traps waits Anne Boleyn, and you already know the ending she's walking toward. But tonight, you meet her long before the blade falls. She's impossible to miss, a dark-eyed figure in a French hood, her gown a precise arrangement of satin and embroidery that says she belongs at the very centre of the room. One fact sits sharp and undeniable. Anne was the second wife of King Henry VIII, the woman whose marriage to the king split England from the Catholic Church, igniting a religious upheaval that would ripple across centuries. Historians still argue whether Anne was primarily a political pawn, a master strategist, or simply a woman who happened to catch the wrong man's eye at the wrong or right moment. You first see her across a glittering hall where music swells like warm wine. She's not the most beautiful woman here, at least by the paint and pearls standards of the age, but she moves with the kind of self-possession that makes beauty irrelevant. You notice her hands, long, quick fingers that tap lightly against her skirts as she listens, weighing each word that's spoken. It's easy to forget she wasn't supposed to be queen at all. Anne came to court as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife. The flirtations began quietly. Playful glances, witty exchanges, but they grew into something that could no longer hide in the background. Henry was captivated, and here the scandal began. To marry Anne, he would have to annul his first marriage, an act Rome refused to bless. A quirky tidbit drifts through the candlelight. Anne was said to enjoy wearing yellow, a colour rare and striking in Tudor England. Some accounts claim she chose it deliberately during the mourning for Catherine, interpreted by her detractors as a calculated insult, though defenders argue it was actually a symbol of celebration in Spanish tradition. Historians still debate whether she meant it as triumph or simply tradition, but you can imagine her standing in a sea of black gowns, luminous and unapologetic. The court divides along invisible lines. Some admire her intelligence, her patronage of reformist thinkers, her confidence in navigating the king's attention without surrendering too quickly. Others see only ambition, a woman manipulating her way to a crown. Henry's desire for her grows obsessive, a hunger not just for her company, but for the legitimacy of a son she might bear him. You follow her through a smaller chamber now, the noise of the hall muffled by carved screens. She speaks with Thomas Cromwell, the king's advisor, her voice low and precise. There's a sharpness here, a recognition that in this court alliances are as perishable as fruit left in the sun. The conversation turns on the redistribution of monastic lands, a move tied directly to the break with Rome. Every smile hides an agenda, every nod is a chess piece sliding into place. When Henry finally marries Anne in 1533, it is in defiance of papal authority, and the English Reformation surges forward. The stakes have never been higher, yet the same volatility that brought her to the throne will soon tip against her. Failing to produce a male heir, though she gives birth to the future Elizabeth I, becomes the first crack in the foundation. Her temper, sharp wit and unwillingness to fade into the background make her dangerous in a court where a queen is expected to be seen but rarely heard. Rumours begin their slow poison. Accusations of adultery, incest and treason spread like frost on a window. You can almost feel the chill creeping in as former allies step back, unwilling to stand in the king's path. Historians still argue whether these charges were entirely fabricated by Cromwell to remove a political obstacle, or whether Anne's flirtations crossed lines too blurry for her enemies' liking. A fringe detail you can't shake. In one of her final imprisonments in the Tower of London, Anne was reported to have laughed. Yes, laughed at the absurdity of the charges against her. Some say it was hysteria, others say defiance, but you imagine it was a final refusal to give her accusers the satisfaction of seeing her broken. You follow her down a corridor lined with narrow windows, the light spilling in like cold milk. Outside you see the Tower Green, the scaffold already being prepared. It is said she chose a French swordsman for her execution instead of the traditional axe, a cleaner, quicker death. You picture her standing there, gown gathered neatly, the wind tugging at her veil, speaking calmly to the crowd as if delivering the conclusion of a story she'd already rehearsed. In her last moments, she avoids condemning Henry, choosing instead to praise the gentlest and most merciful prince. It's a masterclass in self-control, or perhaps one final strategic move, ensuring her family's survival after her death. When the sword falls in May 1536, the court doesn't fall silent, it pivots. Already, Henry is preparing to marry Jane Seymour. The halls you've been walking fill again with music, as if grief were a luxury the crown can't afford. And yet, centuries later, Anne's name burns brighter than most of her contemporaries. The woman accused of betraying her king becomes the mother of one of England's greatest monarchs. The scandal meant to erase her instead brands her into history. You glance back one last time toward the tower, its grey stone catching the fading light. Somewhere, you think you can still hear that defiant laugh, sharp, quick, and entirely unwilling to vanish quietly into the background. The air shifts again as you leave the tower's stone chill behind. You pass through a corridor that smells faintly of beeswax and roast meats, the sounds of lutes and murmured conversation drifting closer until the space opens into a great hall. The light here is golden, almost syrupy, falling over groaning banquet tables and glittering goblets. But if you lean in past the laughter and the fragrance of cinnamon and clove, you catch the subtler scent beneath, sharp, bitter, metallic. It is the rumour you've come for, the one that clings stubbornly to the name Catherine de Medici. She sits at the far end of the table, her gown heavy with pearls, her face framed by the high ruff fashionable in 16th century France, a fact you can pin to the tablecloth. Catherine was queen consort to King Henry II of France, mother to 3 kings, and a formidable political operator in an era when France was fracturing along religious lines. Historians still argue whether she was the ruthless puppeteer her enemies painted, or simply a survivor in a court that demanded a taste for bloodless cruelty. You ease closer to the feast, where swan and venison share space with candied fruits and steaming bowls of spiced wine. The clatter of knives and forks becomes rhythmic, hypnotic, until you notice the way some guests glance uneasily at their plates. This is the heart of Catherine's most enduring scandal, the whispered belief that she dabbled in poisons, keeping them hidden in rings or perfume bottles, and that her banquets were as dangerous as any battlefield. A fringe tidbit surfaces from the steam. One courtier claimed that Catherine's private cabinet contained small ornate boxes, each filled with powders of unknown purpose. Some swore they were just cosmetics, others that they were death in its most elegant form. There's no firm proof she used such poisons, but the rumour, once seeded, grew wits. You suspect the truth is messier, part fear of a foreign-born queen, Catherine was Italian from the powerful Medici family, part projection from those who couldn't explain her survival in a court where rivals vanished overnight. Tonight, the hall pulses with the kind of unease that follows too many political reversals. France is deep in the wars of religion, Catholics and Huguenots locked in a spiral of distrust and reprisal. Catherine navigates this chaos with a mixture of diplomacy, coercion, and carefully timed pageantry. You watch her lift her goblet and smile across the table, her eyes fixed on a nobleman who had, only weeks earlier, been railing against her policies. Now he raises his own cup in return. Historians still debate her role in the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572, when thousands of Huguenots were killed in Paris and beyond. Was she the mastermind, orchestrating the slaughter as a calculated strike against Protestant influence? Or was she a ruler swept up in events she could only partly control, trying to steady the throne for her young son, King Charles IX? The arguments spiral into the same kind of smoke that hangs above this hall, thick, opaque, and impossible to clear. You follow her to a smaller, private chamber where the air is cooler and quieter. Here she meets with her astrologer, Cosimo Ruggieri. The two lean over charts and celestial diagrams, their heads bent close together. To some, astrology is harmless entertainment. To her enemies, it's another shadowy practice, proof that she surrounds herself with the arcane. You think of Joan of Navarre's incense, Lucrezia Borgia's perfumes, the way women in power are always framed as dabblers in the mysterious, especially when those mysteries can't be easily explained or controlled. A quirky detail drifts into the moment. Catherine was known to commission elaborate poison garden displays for court entertainments, though these were more likely botanical curiosities than deadly arsenals. Still, it's easy to see how a visitor could confuse the strange blooms and toxic herbs for something more sinister. You imagine her strolling through such a garden, skirts whispering over gravel, the guests nervously eyeing each plant as if it might leap out and bite them. The political feast continues the next day in the form of a wedding, her daughter Margaret of Valois to Henry of Navarre, a Protestant. It is meant to signal unity, but the streets outside hum with tension. Within days, the celebration will curdle into bloodshed, and Catherine's name will be forever entangled in the disaster. Whether she lit the spark or merely failed to stop the fire, history leaves her holding a torch. You see her later, older, moving slowly through the halls of the Louvre. Her sons, Francis II, Charles IX, Henry III, each wore the crown, each leaned heavily on her counsel, and each left the throne weaker than before. Yet Catherine endured, navigating a court where favour shifted daily and survival often depended on being underestimated. She pauses at a window overlooking the Seine. The city sprawls beyond, noisy and are restless, but here she is alone with her thoughts. The sunlight turns her pearl necklace into a string of pale moons. "They feared me," you can almost hear her say, "because they could not command me." The banquet hall behind her still smells faintly of wine and spice, but also of something sharper, a lingering note that could be rosemary or could be something more dangerous. You know better than to ask which. In this court, as in so many others, mystery is a weapon, and Catherine de' Medici wields it with a steady hand. The golden haze of Catherine's banquet dissolves into cooler, paler light, as if someone has drawn a sheer curtain over the sun. You find yourself walking through a long marble corridor, the kind that makes your footsteps sound louder than they are. Ahead, a great doorway swings open to reveal frescoed ceilings and corridors that twist like the rumours of Rome itself. The Vatican looms nearby, but your attention is drawn to a smaller, more intimate set of rooms, heavy with the scent of lilies and parchment. This is where Lucrezia Borgia's legend lives, a fact that will not budge from the record. Lucrezia was the daughter of Rodrigo Borgia, better known as Pope Alexander VI, and sister to Cesare Borgia, the military leader whose name still tastes of ambition and ruthlessness. Her family's rise was meteoric, scandalous, and as tangled as a pile of rosary beads in a drawer. Historians still argue whether Lucrezia was an innocent pawn in her family's machinations or an active conspirator in their schemes. You catch your first sight of her across a sunlit chamber, standing beside a table stacked with correspondence. She wears a gown of pale gold, her hair arranged in a net of fine pearls. It's not her beauty that stops you. It's the way she seems to listen to every sound in the room without looking away from the letter in her hand. There's a composure here, as if she's been trained to stay unshaken no matter what name is whispered in her direction. The stories about her are so lurid they sound like medieval gossip blogs, poison hidden in hollow rings, affairs with her own family members, a string of strategically timed marriages that just happened to align with the Borgia's political needs. The fringe tidbit everyone loves to repeat, without much proof, is that she kept a stash of powdered poison called cantarella, passed along in sweetened wine to dispatch enemies. Some crow Nicholas swore it was true. Others claimed the rumors were seeded by rivals eager to tarnish her. You suspect both sides enjoyed the drama too much to stop. Your feet carry you into a private salon, the walls hung with tapestries of hunting scenes, stags pursued by hounds through forests so detailed you almost expect the leaves to rustle. At the center of the room is a carved chair, and beside it a writing desk cluttered with letters. You glance at the seals, some broken, some still intact, all bearing the marks of powerful families. This is Lucrezia's battlefield, not fields or castles, but ink, wax, and carefully chosen words. One quirky note softens the sharpness. Lucrezia had a love of poetry and music, and was herself an accomplished musician. In some courts she organized elaborate entertainments where madrigals were sung and dances performed under her direction. It's the sort of detail that feels dissonant with her darker legend, like catching a glimpse of a cat curled in the sun right after it's knocked over your favorite vase. Her marriages read like a map of shifting alliances. First to Giovanni Sforza, annulled after political winds changed. Then to Alfonso of Aragon, whose murder was likely arranged by her brother Cesare. Finally to Alfonso d'Este, Duke of Ferrara, where she found a more stable, if still politically charged, home. In each she adapts, changes costume and role, and somehow emerges more influential than before. Historians still debate how much agency she had in these moves. Was she a willing player in the Borgia strategy, or a piece moved across the board by more ruthless hands? You see hints of both. A woman who learned quickly that survival required flexibility, but who also understood that being underestimated was its own kind of shield. You trail her to a balcony overlooking a formal garden, the air heavy with orange blossoms. She leans on the railing, gazing down at the symmetrical paths, the fountains throwing arcs of water into the afternoon heat. Somewhere, a bell rings from the Vatican, and she turns her head slightly, as if listening for a signal you can't hear. A fringe rumor slips into your thoughts. Some claimed Lucrezia wore a necklace strung not with gems, but with tiny capsules, each containing poison, perfume, or powder for sealing letters. Whether it was ever real is almost irrelevant. The image has survived so vividly it might as well be fact in the public imagination. The scandal that clings to her is less about specific acts and more about the atmosphere she lived in. The Borgia name was a lightning rod for envy, fear, and fascination, and Lucrezia, positioned between powerful men and volatile politics, became both a target and a shield. She could be painted as a seductress one year and a saintly duchess the next, depending on who held the pen. Later in Ferrara, she withdraws somewhat from the stage of high politics, focusing on her children and her court's cultural life. She sponsors poets, musicians, and artists, turning her residence into a center of Renaissance refinement. This quieter chapter doesn't erase her earlier reputation, it just adds another layer to it, making the legend harder to pin down. You watch her now as she steps back inside, the light catching in her hair. She closes a letter with a firm press of the seal, hands it to a wait-in servant, and smiles, not the warm smile of a friend, but the practiced, perfect curve of someone who knows exactly how much of herself to show. Outside, the Vatican bells toll again, and you feel the pull of the next room, the next queen, the next shadowed corner of history. But for a moment you linger, tasting the faint tang of orange blossom on the air and wondering whether the real Lucrezia was ever quite as dangerous as the stories make her, or far more so. You leave the warm, perfumed air of Ferrara's gardens behind, and the world sharpens into a crisp, wintry clarity. Your boots crunch over frost-laced cobblestones as the city falls away behind you. The air smells of wood smoke and something faintly metallic, like the edge of a blade left out in the cold. Ahead, the glow of a northern court emerges from the dark. Stockholm in the 17th century, where the woman you've come to meet has already decided she's had enough of being queen. Queen Christina of Sweden, scholar, patron of the arts, political wildcard, is standing in the center of a candlelit library, its shelves groaning with leather-bound books. A fact you can hang on the spine of this scene. She ascended the throne in 1632 at the age of 6, ruling in her own right from 18 until her shocking abdication in 1654. Historians still argue whether her decision to leave the throne was an act of personal liberation, a calculated political move, or the product of court pressures that became unbearable. She's dressed tonight not in shimmering silks but in a heavy fur-trimmed robe. Her hair, loose and slightly wild, catches the flicker of the candles. You can almost feel the hum in the air. Christina is not the kind of monarch who drifts lazily through ceremonial duties. She reads voraciously, debates philosophy until dawn, and fills her court with painters, scholars, and musicians. In a time when queens were expected to marry and secure dynastic stability, she flatly refuses, batting away suitors with the same ease she dispatches an undercooked roast back to the kitchens. A quirky tidbit that draws a smile. She was known to stride through the palace in men's clothing, sometimes even wearing boots spattered with mud from her long walks. It scandalized some of her courtiers, thrilled others, and made foreign ambassadors shuffle nervously in their seats. Was it defiance, comfort, or a deliberate performance of authority that refused to be bound by gendered expectations? Historians still argue, but you can tell she enjoyed the effect. You follow her as she moves through the library, trailing a finger along the spines of books until she stops, pulls one free, and flips it open without even glancing at the title. She's restless. The throne, for all its power, feels like a trap to her. You can hear it in the way she talks, her voice low, quick, peppered with references to plays, treatises, and theological arguments. The scandal that clings to her isn't a single salacious event, but the sum of her unconventional choices. She delays her coronation, avoids marriage, and spends lavishly on art and scholarship while the treasury strains. Then, in a move no one sees coming, she announces she will abdicate. The official reason: she doesn't want to marry and can't produce an heir. The unofficial undercurrent: she is tired of the compromises the throne demands. One fringe detail that fascinates. Her abdication ceremony was said to be so quiet and solemn that you could hear the scrape of her crown being set down on the table. No grand speeches, no dramatic tears, just the sound of a life turning on its heel. You imagine the room holding its breath, courtiers frozen between awe and disbelief. After abdicating, she leaves Sweden altogether, converting to Catholicism in defiance of her Lutheran homeland. This alone cements her reputation as unpredictable, even dangerous, in the eyes of her former subjects. She travels to Rome, where she becomes a fixture in intellectual circles and a patron of artists, living on her own terms. You watch her now, years after the abdication, sitting in a Roman salon with a glass of wine in one hand and a philosopher's letter in the other. Her laugh is low and genuine, and her posture is relaxed in a way it never was on the throne. She has traded the cold discipline of royal duty for the warm chaos of self-determination. Historians still debate her private life, her close relationships with women, her refusal to explain herself to those who demanded it, the quiet network of influence she maintained even without a crown. There are letters full of warmth and wit that hint at affections she never discussed in public. Some see her as a queer icon centuries ahead of her time, others as a political exile who reinvented herself as a cultural force. A quirky echo from her later years: she was buried 3 times. The first burial was rushed, the second more ceremonial, and the third in St. Peter's Basilica, an honor given to very few women. You can't help thinking she would have enjoyed the absurdity of it, turning even her death into an event with multiple acts. The cold Swedish air is gone now, replaced by the hum of a Roman evening outside her window. Lantern light dances on the walls, and you can almost smell the rosemary and roasting chestnuts drifting up from the streets. Christina leans back in her chair, watching you as though she knows you've been following her story. "A crown is only heavy," she says softly, "if you don't know when to take it off." Outside, bells ring across the city, and you feel the story shifting again, drawing you toward another queen whose fate would hinge not on abdication but on the dangerous intimacy of letters. The warm Roman light fades into a dusk brushed with mist, and your steps echo on flagstones slick from a day's rain. You're in a stone corridor now, the air cool and smelling faintly of wool and candle smoke. Beyond a narrow archway, the space opens into a grand yet dimly lit hall, tapestries muffling the sounds of boots and whispered voices. This is England again, mid-16th century, and somewhere in the tangle of politics and ambition waits Mary, Queen of Scots, her hands and fate wrapped around a set of letters that may or may not have condemned her. A fact that can't be argued. Mary reigned as Queen of Scotland from infancy, was briefly Queen Consort of France, and later became a political prisoner in England for nearly 2 decades under her cousin Elizabeth I. Historians still argue whether Mary was a tragic pawn undone by circumstance or an active conspirator in plots against Elizabeth's life. You first see her standing near a table scattered with correspondence, the wax seals catching the candlelight. She's tall, poised, her auburn hair coiled into an intricate braid beneath a simple headdress. The room smells faintly of parchment and ink, and there's an energy to her movements, a restless urgency, as though she's already thinking of the next message to be sent before the first has even left the room. The scandal at the heart of her downfall centres on the Babington plot, a conspiracy to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary on the English throne. The so-called casket letters are another knot in the rope, love letters and political missives allegedly proving her complicity in the murder of her second husband, Lord Darnley. Some claim these letters are forgeries, others swear by their authenticity. The ink, the handwriting, the phrasing, every detail has been scrutinised for centuries, yet no consensus emerges. Historians still debate whether they are the smoking gun of her guilt or the carefully planted evidence of her enemies. A quirky detail slips into the scene. Mary often wrote her most sensitive letters in cipher, using intricate codes that required a key to read. She trusted a small circle of couriers to carry them, often hiding the notes in the linings of garments or sewn into the bindings of books. Imagine that, a monarch's life and claim to power tucked between pages, riding across muddy roads in a saddlebag. You follow her as she crosses the hall, her skirts whispering over the rushes strewn on the floor. She pauses at a narrow window, looking out at the bleak winter gardens of Chartley Hall. Snowflakes drift down through the dusk, catching in the bare branches. Somewhere in the shadows, you sense the presence of Sir Francis Walsingham's agents, watching, listening, waiting for the slip that will seal her fate. One fringe rumour clings like frost. Some say Mary hid a last desperate letter inside the hollow stem of a quill, meant for an ally across the channel. Whether it ever left the room or was quietly intercepted before it could fly is lost to time. You picture her writing by lamplight, her breath fogging the air, knowing every word might be her last. When the Babington plot is uncovered in 1586, the evidence includes ciphered letters linking Mary directly to the assassination plan. Whether the link is genuine or manufactured, the result is the same. She is tried for treason against Elizabeth. The trial is a theatre of inevitability, its outcome decided before the curtain rises. You see her now on the morning of her execution, February 8, 1587. She wears a black gown over a crimson petticoat, the red of Catholic martyrdom, and walks steadily to the scaffold. The crowd is silent except for the murmur of prayer. She forgives her executioner, kneels, and lays her head upon the block. One stroke is not enough, and you flinch, though she does not. The moment hangs in the cold air like breath. The letters remain, locked in their mystery. Were they Mary's own hand, or an elaborate trap? Historians still pore over the phrasing, the idioms, the slant of each letter. You suspect part of the truth lies not in what they say, but in the fact that so many wanted them to say it. A softer note surfaces. Mary was a gifted embroiderer, and in her years of captivity she stitched elaborate scenes into her work, sometimes floral patterns, sometimes symbolic designs thought to contain coded messages. You imagine her fingers moving with quiet precision, each thread a strand of defiance. Now, as you step back from the scaffold and into the dim corridors, you feel the weight of her story pressing in. The letters, the codes, the accusations, they're all still here, scattered like petals or evidence depending on how you choose to read them. And somewhere in the shadows, a courier still rides with a sealed note, unaware that history will never stop asking what was really inside. The damp chill of Chartley Hall fades into a warmer, gilded glow, the air thick with perfume and powdered wigs. You've stepped into 18th century France, and the floor beneath you hums with the faint vibrations of music drifting down from a ballroom above. Outside the high windows, Versailles stretches endlessly, a labyrinth of mirrors, gardens and corridors where luxury and danger walk arm in arm. At the center of it all, Marie Antoinette smiles as though the world is hers to command, a fact impossible to erase. She was the last Queen of France before the French Revolution, married to Louis XVI, and her name still summons visions of extravagant gowns and the infamous, though likely apocryphal, "let them eat cake." Historians still argue whether she was a careless spendthrift who ignored the plight of her people, or a scapegoat for a monarchy already collapsing under its own weight. You see her now in a salon, sunlight from tall windows catching the pale blue silk of her gown. Diamonds glitter at her throat, and her powdered hair is arranged into an architectural marvel, part sculpture, part fashion statement, and probably heavy enough to give most people a neck ache. She leans in to whisper to a friend, and the women nearby pretend not to strain their ears. The scandal that clings most stubbornly to her is the affair of the diamond necklace, a bizarre tangle of fraud, miscommunication and opportunism. In 1785, a con woman posing as an intermediary convinced Cardinal de Rohan that he was helping the Queen acquire a lavish diamond necklace to win back her favour. In truth, Marie Antoinette had no involvement, but when the scheme unravelled, the public was only too happy to believe she'd been grasping for yet more luxury at their expense. Historians still debate whether the incident fatally damaged her reputation or merely confirmed what her critics already believed. A cue. Rookie Tidbit dances in from the garden. Marie Antoinette had a private retreat on the grounds of Versailles called the Petit Trianon, where she dressed in simple muslin gowns and played at being a shepherdess. She kept miniature sheep and even milked cows, albeit with porcelain pails painted to look rustic. The contrast between this peasant play and the grinding poverty outside the palace walls was not lost on observers, though in her mind it was a respite from court protocol, not a statement on politics. You follow her through the Hall of Mirrors, where sunlight ricochets between crystal chandeliers and polished glass. Courtiers bow and smile, but behind those expressions are calculations. Every move the Queen makes is noted, discussed, exaggerated. When she dances too much, they say she's frivolous. When she withdraws, they say she's haughty. In the salons of Paris, pamphlets circulate with caricatures showing her in compromising poses, entangled with lovers she never had. The libelles blur truth and invention until there's no way to separate them. One fringe rumour still lingers like the scent of musk in the air. Some claim she had a hidden passage built between her chambers and those of a supposed lover, a fabrication so juicy that it found its way into political cartoons and bawdy songs. No evidence ever surfaced, but in a revolutionary climate, rumour carried more weight than proof. You see her again in the Petit Trianon, strolling the gardens in a straw hat, a basket of flowers on her arm. The air smells of roses and damp earth, but there's a tremor beneath it. News from Paris about unrest, about shortages, about resentment. She walks faster, as if trying to stay ahead of the tide, but history is already moving faster than she can. By 1789, the revolution is in full swing. Versailles becomes a gilded prison as mobs march on the palace. You picture her standing on the balcony during the October days, facing a crowd that's been whipped into fury. She doesn't faint or flee, she bows. For a moment, the gesture works, the crowd cheers, but the wave cannot be turned back. Her imprisonment is harsher than any gilded exile. In the Temple prison, her diamonds and silks are replaced with plain gowns, her attendants reduced to a few loyal souls. Even here, rumours persist. Plots to free her, schemes to exchange her for political prisoners, whispers that she still communicates with foreign allies. The walls seem to lean in, listening. In October 1793, she is tried for treason. The charges are a poisonous mix, conspiring with foreign powers, depleting the treasury and, most grotesquely, corrupting her own son. The last is almost certainly a fabrication, but it sticks, adding fuel to the fire. She defends herself with dignity, but the verdict is predetermined. On the morning of her execution, she rides to the guillotine in an open cart. The streets are silent except for the rumble of the wheels. Dressed in a plain white own, she climbs the scaffold, accidentally steps on the executioner's foot and apologizes. Her final words. The blade falls and the crowd roars. Yet even in death, her image refuses to settle. Historians still debate how much of her scandal was real and how much was constructed by a society hungry for symbols to destroy. The Marie Antoinette who played shepherdess, the one who bowed to a furious crowd, the one accused of crimes too grotesque to imagine, they are all masks, and the truth may be lost between them. As you step out of Versailles into the autumn air, the scent of roses fades, replaced by the acrid tang of smoke from the city. Somewhere, a pamphleteer is already setting her story in ink, ensuring that the queen who lost her head will live forever, whether she wanted to or not. The clamour of the revolutionary crowd fades into a steadier, more deliberate hum. The sound of carriage wheels on London cobblestones, the rise and fall of shouts from street hawkers, and the distant tolling of St. Paul's bells. The air here smells of damp wool, coal smoke, and hot chestnuts roasting in iron pans at street corners. You've stepped into the early 19th century, and the scandal you're about to witness is less about hidden letters or whispered poison, and more about a public trial that became the talk of the entire kingdom. At its centre is Queen Caroline of Brunswick, a woman whose private life was dragged onto the most public stage imaginable. The fact that anchors you, Caroline was the wife of George IV, though their marriage was strained from the start. When George was still Prince of Wales, he was already dreading the match arranged for him, and Caroline, blunt and unafraid of speaking her mind, was hardly inclined to play the demure consort. Historians still argue whether she was the victim of a vindictive husband determined to rid himself of her, or a free spirit whose behaviour, by the stiff moral codes of the day, was bound to ignite scandal. You see her first arriving in England in 1795, stepping from her carriage with the confident air of someone who knows the crowd's eyes are on her. Her gown is richly embroidered, her smile quick and broad, but even at this first meeting George is said to have been repulsed. He takes one look, greets her coldly, and later tells friends she was unwashed and coarse. She, in turn, finds him fat and self-indulgent. It's hardly the stuff of romance. The marriage deteriorates almost instantly. They have one child, Princess Charlotte, but soon live apart, each keeping to their own households. Caroline becomes known for her warmth with the public and her sometimes eccentric manners. She speaks her mind without filtering. It for courtly polish, embraces commoners, and adopts stray animals into her retinue. A quirky tidbit, she once famously kept a goat as a pet, letting it wander freely in her garden at Blackheath. The newspapers loved it. George did not. Then comes the real scandal. In 1814, while living abroad in Italy, Caroline takes up residence at a villa on Lake Como. Her companion is Bartolomeo Pergami, an Italian servant who rises rapidly through her household to become her chamberlain. Soon rumours swirl of a romantic relationship between the two, rumours encouraged, and perhaps even paid for, by agents of her husband. Witnesses claim they've seen them sharing intimate moments, travelling together, even sharing a bedroom. Caroline, for her part, refuses to dignify the accusations with meek silence, meeting them with defiance and sardonic wit. The fringe detail that seems almost too theatrical to be real. Some accounts allege that George's spies once rifled through her laundry searching for evidence of impropriety. Whether or not it happened, it captures the absurdity of the lengths to which her opponents would go. By 1820, George has become king and is determined to prevent Caroline from being crowned alongside him. Parliament is thrown into uproar as he pursues a bill to dissolve the marriage and strip her of the title of Queen. What follows is the trial of Queen Caroline, a proceeding in the House of Lords that draws enormous crowds and daily headlines. Public opinion largely sides with Caroline, partly out of sympathy, partly because George is deeply unpopular. You follow her into the chamber where the trial unfolds. She sits at a small table, dressed simply but elegantly, her expression alert and composed. The lords listen as witness after witness testifies, some recounting supposed scenes of her intimacy with Pergami, others describing her behaviour abroad in ways meant to paint her as morally unfit. The evidence is shaky, often hearsay, but the spectacle is irresistible. In the streets outside, vendors sell caricatures showing George as a bloated villain and Caroline as a wronged heroine. Historians still debate whether Caroline's relationship with Pergami was romantic or simply close companionship inflated into scandal by her enemies. What's certain is that the bill against her ultimately fails. Parliament refuses to pass it, sensing the public backlash it would provoke. She emerges from the trial triumphant, at least in the court of public opinion, and is greeted with cheers as she rides through London. But the victory is short-lived. When George's coronation is held in 1821, Caroline arrives at Westminster Abbey and demands to be admitted. She is barred at the door. It's a humiliation she never recovers from. Just weeks later, she falls ill and dies, her final request being to have the injured Queen of England inscribed on her coffin. A quirky echo from her funeral. As her procession made its way through London, soldiers clashed with mourners who tried to accompany her casket, resulting in injuries and chaos, a last chaotic reflection of the tumult she brought to the monarchy. In the end, Caroline's scandal wasn't about secret letters or political plots. It was about a battle fought in full daylight with the newspapers as her second and the crowds as her jury. Even now, historians still wrestle with her legacy. Was she a wronged woman whose independence threatened a hypocritical establishment, or a royal who knew exactly how to play to the gallery? As you step away from the echo of her trial, the city's noise swells around you again, shouts of vendors, the clip of horses, and somewhere in the mix, the faint sound of a cheer still rising for a queen who refused to bow quietly. The clamour of London fades into the muffled hush of candlelight on marble floors. The air is warmer here, touched with the faint sweetness of beeswax and incense, the kind that lingers in vast cathedrals and imperial halls. You're in Constantinople now, 6th century Byzantium, where gold mosaics catch the glow of hundreds of oil lamps. In the centre of this shimmering world, a woman walks with the self-possession of someone who knows she's not supposed to be here at all. Empress Theodora. A fact carved as firmly as the stones beneath your feet. Theodora rose from a background so scandalous to her critics that they weaponized it against her for her entire reign. Before marrying Emperor Justinian I, she was said to have been an actress, and in Byzantine terms, actress carried implications of sexual availability as much as theatrical skill. Historians still argue about the accuracy of the salacious accounts from Procopius's Secret History, which paints her as both an extraordinary beauty and an unapologetic schemer. Was she really as scandalous as her enemies claimed, or was she simply too powerful a woman for their comfort? You first glimpse her in the Hippodrome, the massive chariot racing stadium of Constantinople. It stands roaring with colour-coded factions, blues and greens, whose political loyalties are as fierce as their sporting rivalries. She sits in the imperial box, a jewelled diadem circling her dark hair, her eyes steady and unreadable as she watches the races. Justinian, not yet emperor, sits beside her, the crowd murmuring about their unconventional match. One quirky tidbit that refuses to fade. Theodora was said to have once performed a comedic routine with trained geese that scandalized the city. Whether true or an invention of her enemies, the story became shorthand for her supposed immorality. And yet, here she is now, wrapped in imperial purple with sea, nators bowing low as they pass. When Justinian becomes emperor in 527, Theodora is crowned alongside him, not as a decorative consort but as co-ruler, her authority written into law. She advises on matters of state, receives foreign envoys, and shapes imperial policy, particularly in areas affecting women. She strengthens laws against human trafficking, improves divorce rights for women, and offers protection to actresses, perhaps in recognition of her own past. But scandal clings, partly because she refuses to behave as a silent ornament. You follow her into a council chamber during the Nika riots of 532, when the city is in flames and Justinian's advisors urge him to flee. Theodora's voice cuts through the panic. Royalty is a fine burial shroud. It's a line historians still debate, whether it's exact quotation or polished invention, but it captures the steel in her presence. She convinces Justinian to stay and crush the revolt, a decision that saves his throne but costs tens of thousands of lives. A fringe rumour hovers at the edge of this moment. Some chroniclers claim she used the chaos to eliminate political rivals quietly, ensuring that those who might later oppose her reforms never got the chance. There's no hard proof, but the neatness with which some enemies vanish from the record is enough to keep the whispers alive. You see her later in the Hagia Sophia, the newly rebuilt cathedral rising in glory after the riot's destruction. Sunlight pours through high windows, striking the gold tiles so that the whole space seems to shimmer like a mirage. Theodora walks slowly down the nave, her robes whispering against the marble, stopping to greet dignitaries and petitioners. She moves like a woman who knows every gaze in the room is tracking her, and who has decided to meet each gaze head-on. Historians still wrestle with the two Theodoras that survive in the record, the patron saint of women's rights in the empire and the ruthless manipulator who never forgot a slight. Perhaps, as with so many queens and empresses before her, the truth is that she was both, because power in her hands required her to be. A softer detail surfaces in her later years. She kept a small chapel in the palace, where she would sit for hours in quiet prayer, the only sound the faint crackle of oil lamps. Here she is not the empress or the scandal, but a woman aware of her mortality, still shaping policy and court life even as illness begins to slow her. When she dies in 548, Justinian mourns her deeply, and her name is carved into the city's memory in mosaics and marble. Even centuries later, when visitors step into the Basilica of San Vitale in Ravenna and see her image, crowned, jewelled, holding a chalice, they're looking at the deliberate crafting of a legacy. As you step back into the lamplight of Constantinople's streets, the scent of incense fades, replaced by the sharper air of the city outside. Theodora remains behind in the palace, watching from her mosaicked throne, a reminder that sometimes the most scandalous act is simply to rise higher than anyone thought you should. The incense-heavy air of Constantinople thins into something sharper, salted by sea wind and scented faintly with burning palm fronds. The horizon is a sweep of turquoise ocean, broken by the silhouette of a sprawling palace perched on a hilltop above dense green forest. You've crossed to the 19th century now, to the island of Madagascar, where Queen Ranavalona rules with a mix of cunning, paranoia, and iron will that still sparks fierce arguments among historians. A fact that stands like the palace's stone walls, Ranavalona reigned from 1828 to 1861, steering Madagascar through an era when European colonial powers were pressing in on all sides. She resisted foreign influence with relentless energy, keeping her kingdom independent, but at a cost that earned her nicknames ranging from the Mad Queen to the Great Sovereign. Historians still argue whether she was a patriot defending sovereignty or a despot whose cruelty outweighed her achievements. You first glimpse her in the great audience hall, its rafters hung with crimson and gold banners. She's dressed in layers of silken cloth patterned in bright geometric designs, her hair piled high and crowned with gold filigree. Courtiers kneel as she enters, their eyes lowered, not in reverence alone, but in the wary stillness of those who know the Queen's moods can change like a sudden monsoon. The scandal here is not one sharp flash of intrigue, but the steady drumbeat of policies that made her reign infamous. She broke with the friendly ties her late husband had maintained with Christian missionaries, curbing foreign trade and outlawing the spread of Christianity. Those who defied her often faced tangina trials, ritual poison ordeals in which the accused swallowed a mixture made from the toxic tangina nut. Surviving the ordeal was considered proof of innocence. Death was simply divine judgment. A quirky, almost absurd tidbit slips in. Ranavalona had an unusual fondness for keeping lemurs as palace pets. They roamed the gardens and sometimes the audience halls, their big eyes catching the lamplight as if silently judging the proceedings. Foreign envoys often found themselves in tense negotiations while a lemur watched from a carved wooden perch. You walk with her through the palace gardens, the air thick with frangipani and the chatter of tropical birds. She speaks sharply to an advisor about French encroachments along the coast. The political world here is a delicate chessboard, and she plays with precision, shifting alliances with other African kingdoms, restricting foreign merchants, and strengthening the army. It is this unyielding defense of Madagascar's sovereignty that some admire as fiercely as others condemn. The fringe rumour that clings to her, foreign travellers wrote breathlessly of a bloodthirsty queen who executed thousands for minor offences, though modern historians suspect these numbers were inflated by her enemies to justify colonial ambitions. Still, her punishments could be severe, and her court was a place where even high-ranking officials could fall from favour overnight. You see her presiding over a royal ceremony in the rover of Antananarivo. The crowd below cheers and sings, their voices rising in a wave of sound. Ranavalona raises her hand for silence, then addresses them in a voice that carries across the courtyard. She speaks of the island's strength, its independence, and the dangers of foreign interference. The speech is both a warning and a promise. She will not allow Madagascar to become another outpost for European powers. Historians still debate the balance of her motives. Was she motivated by paranoia and personal power, or by a clear-eyed understanding that concessions to France or Britain could mean the end of her kingdom's autonomy? Perhaps both were true, the two threads twisted together into the rope of her reign. A softer note emerges in her later years. The queen, now older, walks slowly through the palace at dusk, the lemurs darting along the walls like shadows. The sun sinks over the ocean, painting the sky in crimson and gold, the same colours as the banners in her audience hall. She pauses, leaning on a carved staff, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Perhaps she is thinking of the generations who will come after her, or perhaps of the rivals and envoys she has outlasted. When she dies in 1861, she leaves behind a kingdom still independent but deeply divided, its future uncertain. Within decades, Madagascar will fall under French control, but Ranavalona's reign remains one of the most fiercely debated in African history, a story that refuses to settle neatly into heroism or villainy. As you step away from the palace into the warm night, the air is alive with the hum of insects and the distant rhythm of drums. The lemurs watch you go, their eyes bright in the dark, as if reminding you that in this court, even the smallest creature sees everything. The humid air of Madagascar thins into a biting cold that seeps through your sleeves. The sky here is an immense pale grey, the kind that flattens light and makes the snow look endless. You're in the Russian Empire now, in the 18th century, where frost crusts the palace windows and your breath fogs as you step inside. The corridors smell faintly of beeswax polish, fur, and the metallic tang of the samovars steaming in every corner. At the heart of these icy halls walks Catherine II, Catherine the Great, a ruler whose accomplishments and rumoured appetites are woven into one of history's most persistent legends. The fact is clear, Catherine reigned from 1762 to 1796, expanding the empire's territory, modernising its administration, and becoming one of the most formidable monarchs in Europe. Historians still argue whether her personal life deserves the scandalous infamy it's been given, or whether the gossip about her lovers and that particularly absurd rumour involving a horse was weaponized by enemies to undermine her authority. You see her now in her study, hunched slightly over a desk strewn with maps. A sable-lined robe drapes from her shoulders, and her hands move deftly as she points to new borders inked in fresh lines. Advisors lean in, murmuring agreements, their eyes flicking nervously to her face, searching for cues. There's no mistaking it. This is a sovereign who commands by intellect as much as by rank. The scandal that clings to her is twofold: her overthrow of her husband, Peter III, and the long list of lovers she kept afterward. The coup in 1762 was swift. Peter, unpopular and erratic, was deposed after less than a year on the throne, and Catherine was crowned in his place. Some see her as a visionary seizing an opportunity, others as a conspirator who sanctioned her husband's assassination. The truth is tangled in political necessity and personal survive. Elements. A quirky tidbit softens the frost. Catherine adored writing letters, not just to lovers, but to philosophers like Voltaire and Diderot. She once exchanged over 500 letters with Voltaire alone, their tone a mixture of intellectual debate and playful banter. It's an image that stands in sharp contrast to the sultry portraits her detractors painted. You follow her down a long gallery lined with portraits of men, generals, nobles, foreign dignitaries, some of whom were more than just political allies. Grigory Orlov, who helped her seize the throne, Grigory Potemkin, her most famous and possibly most enduring companion, and others who came and went from her life like seasons. Historians still debate how much these relationships influenced state affairs. Were these men partners in governance or simply ornaments in her private chambers? The fringe rumour, of course, is the infamous and wholly unfounded claim that she died attempting an intimate act with a horse, a grotesque fabrication likely spread by her enemies after her death. You can almost hear her laughter if she'd been told such nonsense during her lifetime, a dismissive wave of her hand as she returned to discussing grain tariffs or military reforms. The persistence of that rumour says less about her than it does about the enduring appetite for salaciousness over substance. She leads you into the Winter Palace's great hall, where crystal chandeliers blaze against the cold outside. Diplomats from France and Prussia bow low, their words heavy with flattery. Catherine listens, nods, and answers in French, a language she spoke with ease. Her diplomacy is as deliberate as her domestic reforms, reorganizing provincial governments, expanding education, and commissioning art and architecture that rival anything in Western Europe. Yet scandal was never far. Critics whispered that her generosity to lovers came from the state's coffers, though the truth is murkier. Many were rewarded for political loyalty as much as personal affection. And Catherine, fully aware of the whispers, did little to smother them. Sometimes letting a rumour live was easier than trying to kill it. A quieter moment emerges in her private chambers. Catherine sits beside a fire, a small lapdog curled at her feet, reading by lamplight. The snow outside muffles the world, and for a brief stretch she is not the empress, not the seductress, but simply a woman in her 60s, still curious about ideas, still eager to leave a mark that will outlast her body. When she dies in 1796, her funeral is grand, but the gossip machine barely pauses. The myths about her lovers multiply, her political achievements reduced in popular imagination to a series of torrid affairs. Historians still wrestle with the gap between the Catherine of record, the lawmaker, the conqueror, the correspondent, and the Catherine of rumour, draped in scandal like one of her ermine cloaks. You step back into the Russian winter, the cold biting sharper now. The palace windows glow against the darkness, and somewhere inside, Catherine's voice still echoes, commanding, laughing, shaping the empire as easily as she once shaped the stories told about her. The biting Russian winter fades into a softer northern chill, the kind carried on the wind from deep forests and frozen lakes. Your breath fogs in the crisp air as the spires of Stockholm rise again in the distance, but this time the streets and banners are different. You've stepped back to the early 16th century when Sweden was a kingdom in flux and its regent was not a king but a woman, Kristina Gyllenstierna. Her story is less gilded with jewels than most queens, but the political stakes are just as sharp, and the whispers about her alliances just as potent. A fact that holds steady as stone, Kristina was the widow of Sten Sture the Younger, Sweden's regent during its struggle against Danish dominance. After his death in 1520, she assumed leadership of the anti-Danish faction, defending Stockholm against the forces of King Christian II of Denmark. Historians still argue whether her regency was a temporary caretaker role or the kind of de facto rule that proved a woman could command a kingdom as well as any man. You see her now in the grey light of a late afternoon, standing atop Stockholm's fortress walls. She wears a heavy wool cloak lined with fur, her blonde hair braided and pinned under a modest headdress. Below her, the frozen harbour stretches out toward the islands dotted with dark ships anchored like patient predators. Her voice carries over the courtyard as she directs preparations for the city's defence, the men around her nodding and moving to obey. The scandal that trails her is not one of personal moral failings, but of political insinuations. Rumours spread that she was too close to certain noble allies, men whose loyalty to her might have been bound by more than politics. Some contemporaries suggested she used charm to secure military and financial support, a claim that was as much about discrediting a female leader as it was about any actual impropriety. Historians still debate whether these whispers were grounded in reality or were simply the 16th century version of calling a powerful woman's motives into question. A quirky tidbit slips in like snow through a cracked shutter. She was known to personally inspect the city's fortifications, sometimes climbing ladders in her skirts to check the battlements. This habit scandalized some of her contemporaries, not because of the danger, but because it was unseemly for a woman of her rank to be seen scrambling up walls like a common soldier. You follow her into the great hall, where the air is warmer but tense. Nobles argue over strategy, merchants plead for protection of their trade goods, and messengers bring grim news from the countryside. Kristina listens, her expression calm, and then lays out her plan for rationing supplies and bolstering defences. It is the voice of a leader, not a placeholder. But the siege by Christian II wears on, and the eventual surrender of Stockholm brings her under Danish control. She is offered a promise of safety, one that will soon be broken in the infamous Stockholm bloodbath, where scores of Swedish nobles, including some of her allies, are executed. Christina herself is spared, though she is taken prisoner and sent to Denmark. Here the fringe rumour takes root. During her captivity, she is said to have negotiated her survival through a mixture of diplomacy and personal persuasion aimed at certain members of the Danish court. Whether this was calculated political manoeuvring or a fiction woven by enemies, it follows her back into Swedish history. She is eventually released and returns to Sweden, but her political role diminishes as Gustav Vasa rises to power and secures the throne. Even so, she remains a figure of intrigue, a living reminder of the brief, turbulent period when a woman commanded Stockholm's defences and held the loyalty of men in a kingdom at war. In her later years, she retreats into a quieter life, though she still maintains correspondence with political figures. You picture her in a smaller, firelit chamber, the fur cloak replaced with a thick wool shawl, her hands busy with embroidery as she listens to the wind moving over the frozen harbour outside. Historians still puzzle over her exact place in Swedish history. Was she a transitional figure whose regency bought time for others to seize power? Or a ruler in her own right whose achievements were downplayed because of her gender? And those whispered alliances, were they weapons in her arsenal or simply convenient tools for her detractors? As you step out into the snow, the fortress walls loom behind you, their stones cold and unyielding. The harbour ice groans in the night, and somewhere in the sound you think you hear her voice, steady, practical, carrying across the water like an order that will be obeyed. The wind off the Baltic shifts, carrying a tang of salt and the faint creak of ship timbers. But now you're headed further back, into the chill of the early 11th century. The air grows heavier, touched with the smell of pitch from burning torches and the musk of wet wool cloaks. You've crossed into the world of Queen Emma of Normandy, a woman whose life was a continuous negotiation between loyalty, survival, and the unpredictable tides of conquest. Here's the anchor. Emma was queen twice over, first as the wife of Ethelred the Unready, and later as the wife of Knut the Great. She was mother to two future kings of England, Harthacnut and Edward the Confessor, and one of the most politically influential women of her age. Historians still argue whether her shifting alliances were acts of betrayal or simply the only way to stay alive in a century when thrones changed hands by sword and sea. You find her in a candlelit chamber of Winchester, the royal capital. The thick stone walls smell faintly of tallow and damp wool. Emma sits at a table, her gown of deep blue wool trimmed with fox fur, a golden circlet glinting in her auburn hair. She is reading a letter, Latin script, crisp and deliberate, her brow furrowing as she weighs the next move. Her scandal, as her enemies told it, lies in her ability to transfer her loyalty when political winds shifted. When Ethelred dies in 1016 during a time of Danish invasion, she marries Knut, yes, the very man who led the conquest against her first husband's realm. To some chroniclers, this was the ultimate betrayal. To others, it was a masterstroke of diplomacy that preserved her position and influence. Historians still debate whether Emma acted purely for her own security or whether she genuinely believed aligning with Knut was in England's best interest. A quirky detail that softens the steel. Emma was a noted patron of the arts and the Palme Church, and one of the earliest known English queens to commission her own biography, the Encomium Emmae Reginae. The work paints her in a flattering light, downplaying certain awkward moments, like her marriage to her late husband's conqueror, and elevating her as a stabilizing force for the realm. You can almost imagine her dictating notes for the manuscript, carefully editing her own legend while the ink was still wet. You follow her into the great hall where the long hearth spits and hisses with roasting meat. Knut sits beside her, the Danish warlord-turned-king who now wears English robes as comfortably as his old chainmail. They speak in low tones, their hands moving over a map of the North Sea Empire. Emma listens, asks questions, and points out concerns about securing trade routes. This is not the role of a passive queen, she is a partner in rule. But the shifting of allegiances will haunt her. After Knut's death in 1035, the succession becomes a tangled knot. Her son Harthacnut is in Denmark securing his position there, while Knut's son by a previous union, Harold Harefoot, seizes control in England. Emma sides with Harthacnut, holding on to Winchester and the royal treasury, but her position weakens. A fringe rumour creeps in here. In later years, Norman chroniclers hinted, without real evidence, that Emma's political closeness to certain powerful churchmen might have blurred into personal relationships. It's likely a smear meant to tarnish her, but it shows how dangerous her influence was perceived to be. When Harold dies in 1040, Harthacnut takes the throne, restoring Emma's position. But his reign is short, and with his death in 1042, her son by Ethelred, Edward the Confessor, becomes king. Here's where her careful balancing act starts to falter. Edward distrusts her, perhaps because of her long alliance with Knut's faction, perhaps out of old resentment. In 1043, he strips her of lands and treasure, accusing her of conspiring against him. You find her in this low moment, seated alone in a cold chamber, her fingers wrapped around a small carved ivory cross. The tapestries have been removed from the walls, the fire in the hearth burns low. She's survived invasions, royal deaths, and political upheavals, but now the danger is a quieter kind, irrelevance. Still, Emma does not vanish. Edward eventually restores some of her property, and she lives out her later years in Winchester, where she is buried beside Knut. Her life, like the sea routes her husbands once ruled, is a map of shifting currents and calculated harbours. Historians still wrestle with her legacy. Was she the ultimate opportunist, or a political realist navigating a world where loyalty to a dead king could mean your own death? Perhaps she was both. Her survival a testament to the fact that in a century of Viking raids and court intrigue, the most scandalous act of all was to endure. As you step back into the wind off the channel, the night feels restless, full of the sound of waves striking the shore. Somewhere out there, longships cut across the water, carrying messages, cargo, and rumours, exactly the kind of currents Queen Emma knew how to read better than anyone. The cold, salt wind of the channel gives way to the damp, earthy smell of English campgrounds after a rain. The year is the mid-15th century, the air thick with the tension of the Wars of the Roses, a conflict where alliances are drawn and erased in blood and ink. In a large campaign tent, the canvas walls ripple in the wind, candlelight dancing over maps covered with scattered chess pieces marking troop positions. Here stands Queen Margaret of Anjou, not in a court gown, but in riding leathers and a cloak, her hair bound tightly beneath a simple coif. The fact stands, Margaret was the wife of Henry VI, whose bouts of mental illness left her effectively in charge of defending the Lancastrian cause. She became, in the eyes of her supporters, the driving force behind the war effort, and in the eyes of her enemies, the embodiment of ambition and ruthless will. Historians still argue whether she prolonged the war out of necessity or personal thirst for power. You watch her lean over the campaign table, her gloved finger pressing against the figurine of a knight, shifting it toward the Yorkist lines. She's conferring with a cluster of commanders, her French accent sharp against the murmurs of English voices. There's no deference in her tone, only command. The scandal attached to her name isn't just political. From early in the conflict, rumours swirl that her son, Edward of Westminster, is not the king's child at all, but the result of an affair with one of her allies, specifically the Duke of Somerset. It's an accusation that Yorkist propaganda will hammer again and again, portraying her as both adulteress and usurper. Historians still debate whether there's any truth to it, but most agree it was likely slander aimed at undermining Edward's legitimacy. Still, the rumour stuck, as such rumours tend to, shaping how she was remembered for centuries. A quirky detail emerges amid the tension. Margaret was known for travelling with a personal pack of hunting dogs, even on military campaigns. It's said she believed the dogs brought her luck, and she often took time to feed them herself, even while discussing military plans. Picture it, a queen handing out scraps of meat to greyhounds while plotting troop movements. You follow her outside into the muddy camp where soldiers cluster around fires eating from wooden bowls. She moves among them with an ease that's unexpected for a queen, pausing to ask about their injuries, their families, their food. The men straighten when she passes, murmuring their respect. For some, her presence is a rallying point. For others, it's a reminder that this is no ordinary conflict. A fringe rumour from later years claims that during a particularly desperate moment, she promised her knights she would personally lead a cavalry charge if it would win the day. Whether or not she actually did, the image of Margaret, sword in hand, galloping into battle became part of her legend, feared by her enemies, celebrated by her followers. The war grinds on in cycles of victory and defeat. You stand with her at Towton in 1461, snow falling into the churned mud, the battle raging so fiercely it will be remembered as the bloodiest ever fought on English soil. The Lancastrians are routed, and Margaret flees north into Scotland, Edward of Westminster at her side. Even in exile, she works to rebuild her forces, travelling across France to gather support. Historians still debate her motivations in these years. Was she fighting solely for her son's right to inherit, or was she driven by a personal conviction that she alone could save the Lancastrian cause? Either way, her persistence is remarkable. She returns to England in 1471 with a new army, only to be defeated at Tewkesbury. Her son is killed in the aftermath, cutting the heart out of her fight. You see her then, not as the fierce commander in the tent, but as a grieving mother, her face pale and drawn. Captured by the Yorkists, she is eventually ransomed back to France, where she lives quietly for the rest of her life, stripped of her lands and power. Yet even in her diminished circumstances, her reputation remains formidable. A softer detail, in her final years in Anjou, she tended gardens, often working among the roses. Perhaps it was an echo of her old symbol, the red rose of Lancaster, or simply a way to keep her hands busy in the silence left after decades of war. As you step back from the tent's flickering candlelight, the wind carries the faint clang of distant forges, the smell of horses, and the murmur of men swearing oaths before battle. Margaret's shadow stretches long across the muddy ground, a reminder that for some queens the scandal isn't in whispered affairs or stolen jewels. It's in daring to command an army, to claim a battlefield, and to stand at the centre of a war that reshaped a kingdom. The churned mud of Towton fades beneath your feet, replaced by the polished marble of palace corridors in a much more modern age. The air smells faintly of polished wood, perfume, and the delicate rustle of silk against silk. You're in the mid-20th century now, somewhere between chandeliers and camera flashes, where glamour has replaced chainmail, and royal duty is measured as much in photographs as in treaties. This is the world of Queen Soraya Esfandiari Bakhtiari of Iran, a woman whose reign reads like a fairy tale until it ends like a tabloid headline. The fact is simple and shining. Soraya married Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the Shah of Iran, in 1951. At the time, she was hailed as one of the most beautiful women in the world, gracing magazine covers and winning the hearts of an adoring public. Yet her marriage ended less than a decade later, not because of scandal in the usual sense, but because she was unable to produce an heir. Historians still debate whether her divorce was inevitable due to dynastic necessity, or if it was also shaped by court intrigue and the Shah's restlessness. You see her now descending the sweeping staircase of the Neavaran palace, her black hair gleaming beneath a diamond tiara, her evening gown a swirl of pale blue silk. She walks like someone raised in two worlds, European-educated, yet deeply tied to Persian culture. Guests turn their heads as she passes, the flashbulbs of foreign press cameras capturing her every movement. The scandal, if it can be called that, grew in whispers over the years of their marriage. The royal couple was deeply glamorous, hosting lavish state dinners and travelling abroad. But behind the scenes, the absence of children began to weigh heavily. Some claimed she refused fertility treatments, others insisted the problem lay with the Shah. Officially, the matter was never discussed, but in court circles, speculatio ran as freely as champagne at a gala. Historians still argue whether the decision to divorce was purely political or if it carried a more personal fracture. A quirky tidbit shimmers among the jewels. Soraya was nicknamed the Persian Cinderella by the international press after her whirlwind courtship and marriage to the Shah. It's a moniker she reportedly disliked, too sugary for the realities of palace life, but it's stuck in headlines and gossip columns alike. You follow her into a reception room hung with Persian carpets and French crystal chandeliers. She greets diplomats and their spouses with warmth, speaking in flawless French, German and English. Every gesture is graceful, but there's a flicker in her eyes, perhaps an awareness that this glittering chapter cannot last forever. The end comes in 1958. The royal couple announces their separation, with the Shah declaring that it is, with the deepest regret, they must part for the good of the country. Soraya leaves Iran soon after, her departure marked by both public mourning and quiet criticism from traditionalists who felt she had failed in her duty. A fringe rumour from these years suggests that she was offered the chance to remain as queen if the Shah took a second wife to provide an heir, a proposal she refused outright. Whether true or not, the story fits with her public image, poised, proud, and unwilling to be diminished by compromise. In the years after her divorce, Soraya reinvents herself. She moves to Europe, acting in films, modelling and cultivating friendships in the art and fashion worlds. Paparazzi follow her to Rome, Paris and Monte Carlo, capturing images of her in chic sunglasses, walking arm in arm with film stars and aristocrats. To some, it's a life of freedom and reinvention. To others, a bittersweet exile from the palace she once called home. Historians still debate how she should be remembered, an icon of beauty and modernity who refused to bend, or a royal swept aside by the unyielding machinery of dynastic politics. The glamour of her life never quite erases the melancholy of its turning point. You see her one last time in a quiet Paris apartment, decades later. The tiaras are gone, replaced by shelves of books and black and white photographs in silver frames. She pours tea into delicate china cups, her hands steady, her eyes still luminous. Outside, the city hums, but she seems wrapped in a quieter world, as if she's decided her story belongs to her now, not to the papers. As you step away, the memory of silk skirts on marble and the glint of flashbulbs lingers. Queen Soraya's scandal may have been rooted in absence rather than excess, but it left a mark all the same, proof that even in modern times a queen's worth in the public eye could still be measured in heirs as much as in history. The polished marble of Soraya's Paris apartment dissolves into the hush of a great, timeless hall, neither entirely past nor present. The air here is dim and warm, scented with a faint blend of candle wax, parchment, and the lingering ghost of perfume worn by queens long gone. The floor under your feet is not quite stone, not quite wood. It's memory, layered and burnished by centuries of footsteps. In this space, every queen you visited tonight seems to drift at the edges, watching, their scandals like faintly glowing threads weaving into one great tapestry. You move slowly now, the voices of history quieter, their sharp edges dulled by time. Eleanor of Aquitaine still leans in with that half smile, her green velvet gown catching the light. Isabella of France's pale blue silk stirs in a phantom breeze. Joan of Navarre's herbs perfume the air for a heartbeat before fading into Marguerite of Burgundy's cold tower shadow. Anne Boleyn's laugh, dry, defiant, flickers by your ear, and Catherine de' Medici glides past, the scent of spice trailing after her. Lucrezia Borgia's pearls catch the dim light, while Christina of Sweden drapes one booted leg casually over a chair, smirking as if she knows the whole story has been an act. Mary, Queen of Scots, walks by with a folded letter tucked just out of sight. Marie Antoinette offers the faintest bow before retreating into a rustle of silk. Queen Caroline flashes a conspiratorial grin. Theodora's gaze is direct, unflinching. Ranavalona's eyes are sharp as a blade, Catherine the Great's steady as frost. Christina Guildenstern moves with measured steps, Emma of Normandy with a calculating grace, Margaret of Anjou with the stride of a commander, and Soraya. Soraya lingers, luminous in a simple dress, reminding you that Scandal wears many costumes, from whispers to newspaper headlines. The great hall narrows into a corridor lined with tall windows. Beyond the glass is a soft twilight, impossibly slow, as if the sun has decided to linger a little longer. You realize you've been walking for hours, days, centuries, and yet the weight on your shoulders has grown lighter. Each queen's story began with sharp edges, rumor, betrayal, accusation, but by the time they passed into this twilight, the heat had faded, leaving only the shapes of their lives. The Scandals, for all their drama, have become more like old paint on a wall, cracked, faded, but part of the structure. In the end, what remains is the fact that they lived in defiance of what their worlds expected, whether by choice, necessity, or accident. Some ruled armies, others ruled salons, and some ruled nothing at all except themselves, and yet here they all are, still walking, still seen. Your own steps slow, the air grows warmer, softer, the sounds outside distant and muted. The last window gives way to a terrace overlooking a dark garden where the shapes of hedges and statues melt into the night. A fountain murmurs somewhere out of sight, its steady rhythm matching your own breathing. You find a stone bench and sit, the cool surface grounding you, and now the pace of the words themselves slows, stretching out like the shadows in the garden. The wind through the leaves is gentle, brushing your cheek with the faintest sigh. The memories of all those torchlit halls, echoing courtyards and candlelit chambers settle like dust, undisturbed. The queens fade into the dark, not in defeat but in a kind of peace, finally beyond the reach of gossip, their voices now their own. You take one last breath of the warm night air, feeling the weight of centuries drift away. The fountain keeps whispering. Somewhere a nightbird calls once and then falls silent, and in the stillness you realize the stories have done their work, not to shock you awake but to lure, at your mind quiet, full and satisfied, ready to rest. Now, as the Hall of Queens closes behind you, the path ahead feels softer, lined not with marble but with the mossy hush of a moonlit garden. Your steps sink slightly into the earth, the cool night air folding around you like a velvet cloak. The stories you've heard are still there, somewhere in the folds of your memory, but their sharp edges have been rounded by distance. What was once urgent, court whispers, dangerous letters, midnight plots, has settled into the gentle rhythm of remembered lives. The fountain's murmur becomes the center of your awareness, its water catching bits of starlight like scattered coins. The hedges rise around you, sheltering you from the wind. The air smells faintly of jasmine and old paper, like the ghost of a library in bloom. You sink onto a stone bench, and it holds you without question. The queens no longer pass by, they are part of the stillness now, their laughter and defiance dissolved into the soft rustle of leaves overhead. You feel as if you could stay here forever, listening to the water and the wind, knowing that every scandal, every triumph, every whispered accusation has been folded into the same long story, and that story is finally at rest. Your eyes grow heavier as the cool air brushes your skin. The garden is safe. The world beyond it will wait. For now, there is only the quiet, the stars, and the slow, deep breath that tells your body it is time to let go. Somewhere, the last candle gutters out. Somewhere else, the first morning bird is still hours away from its song. You close your eyes. The stories sleep. So do you,